Is this for you? Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Jennifer Lee Disney, and I'm professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and director of the Women's and Gender Studies program here at Winthrop University. And on behalf of President Mahoney, My colleagues, Dr. Guy Reel and Dr. Amy Meter of the Mass Communication Department, Dr. Karen Kudrowski and Ms. Katerina Moyan of the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy, and Ms. Judy Burke-Bynum of South Carolina Humanities, I would like to welcome you to what has become the opening event of the News, Literacy, and the Future of Journalism series. The News, Literacy, and Future of Journalism series is an 8-month, 11-event collaboration between the South Carolina Humanities Council, the South Carolina Press Association, the North Carolina Humanities Council, the Museum in Washington, D.C., the Departments of Mass Communication and Political Science, the West Forum, and the College of Arts and Sciences here at Winthrop University. News Literacy and the Future of Journalism is part of a national initiative on democracy and the informed citizen, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Mellon Foundation. I'll give some of our sponsors. This initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of the vital connections between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and an informed citizenry. Due to Hurricane Florence, we unfortunately had to postpone last night's opening events on fake news and the threat to democracy, featuring Pulitzer Prize winner and Rock Hill native Jim Hoagland. However, we are working to reschedule that event. Right now it's tentatively scheduled for Tuesday, April 2nd. We will keep you posted on that and are keeping everyone in our thoughts and prayers whose lives have been lost and families who have been impacted by the hurricane. The next event in the series, after today's, will be a News Engagement Day observation, Discerning the Truth, Fake News versus the Real Thing, on Tuesday, October 2nd. Also at 11 a.m. in Dina's Place. This event will feature our very own Dr. Amanda Heiner from the Department of English, Dr. Bill Schulte and Dr. Amy Meter from the Department of Mass Communication, and Ms. Michelle Lipkin, Executive Director of the National Association for Media Literacy Education. So please put common time October 2nd on your calendar as well for the second event in the series. Today, I would like to invite you to Winthrop University's Constitution Day observance event entitled Free Speech and the Responsibilities of Citizenship by Dr. Michael Lipscomb. Dr. Lipscomb is a professor of political science, chair of faculty conference, and faculty representative to the Board of Trustees here at Winthrop University. He specializes in political theory and teaches courses in American government, ancient, modern, and contemporary political theory, and American political thought, among others. At the completion of Dr. Lipscomb's talk, and before we open up the conversation for Q&A, we would like to ask you to please log in on your mobile device to take a 6-question multiple-choice survey for the News Literacy series. You can log in using this tiny URL link or this QR code. This will literally take you 1 minute to complete. So we're going to bring this back up after Dr. Lipscomb's talk, and we'll keep it up throughout the Q&A, so you can all take out your phones and take a minute to complete this survey. It's really important for us to get a sense of the attendance and to get feedback on this news literacy event. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over and encourage us all to help welcome Dr. Michael Lipscomb.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everybody. How are we doing today? Good, I hope. Okay. I am going to read a prepared text. I'm going to provide a traditional kind of lecture about today's topic. But I know that sometimes reading a text isn't without cost, right? It could possibly sometimes be less engaging than talking directly to you. In order to mitigate some of the ways in which it's less engaging, we're going to have slides that help carry you through the argument that I'm making. But I also just want to say real quickly a few things about what that argument's going to be. On Constitution Day, I'm going to make the perhaps surprising argument that the Constitution, the constitutional protection of free speech in particular, as important as it is is not enough, particularly when we're talking about the responsibilities of citizenship and what's actually necessary for building and sustaining a vibrant and free kind of culture. Now, the way I'm going to do that is by tracing out two competing models of what citizenship is. One of those models goes back to ancient Greece and is typically called the classical tradition of citizenship. And the other model of more recent origin, associated with the liberal political theory canon, and I will talk about what liberal means in that context. I don't think it means what we mean when we're talking about American politics on a day-to-day basis. But that tradition we're going to trace out as well. And what I'm going to argue is that neither one of these traditions, as important as they are enough in and of themselves to build and support the vibrant kind of free culture that I think we should endorse. And so I'm going to try to show how those two different traditions, despite their analytical distinction, actually overlap with one another. They overlap historically, and I'm going to go further and argue that they should be brought together in an intentional way. I think by doing that, we have a robust model of citizenship that will put us in a position to respond to some of the particular challenges that we face here in 2018. In particular, it helps us face the challenges presented by what I'm going to call the post-truth era in which we live. And it's also going to be a way of thinking about how we might best respond to some of the challenges facing higher education. So that gives you a little bit of a thumbnail sketch about where this lecture is going to go. Now, the one other thing I just want to add is that most of you in here have had to take HMXP, or you're taking it now, or you will take it next semester. I just want to note that a large number of texts, probably 6 or 7 different texts that I will be deploying in making my argument, are texts that are in the HMXP reader. And the fact that they're in the HMXP reader is not unrelated to the argument that I'm going to make here. Okay? So let me start reading. Free speech and the responsibilities of citizenship. As part of our observance of Constitution Day, our discussion is necessarily grounded in the text of the Constitution. Certainly then, the words of the Constitution's First Amendment's protections of freedom of speech and the related freedoms of religion, the press, assembly, and petition should remain close at hand. And if we read the First Amendment text, which I think we have in front of us, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I want, however, to suggest that these protections against governmental intrusion are necessary, but insufficient for sustaining the kind of free society that we could optimally cherish. And to that end, I want to move our discussion towards a consideration of free speech in relationship to what I call our responsibilities of citizenship. And this only makes sense considering the close historical connection between freedom of speech to the ideas and practices of citizenship. As long as people have been talking about citizenship, they've been talking about the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. As we will see, tracing the relationship between freedom of speech and citizenship will reveal two distinct but complementary traditions of what counts as citizenship. These two traditions are typically defined as the classical tradition and the liberal tradition of citizenship, which, despite their differences, share a recognition that the free exchange of ideas and the pursuit of the truth is central to the practice and potential of citizenship, and by extension, the best health of our society. Let's begin then with the classical tradition of citizenship, which finds its most famous expression in the work of the ancient Greek philosopher, Aristotle, who lived from 384 BC to 322 BC. For Aristotle, citizenship is central to realizing the fullest potential of human beings. As Aristotle puts it, man, and you always have to write sick behind this, right? He uses the gendered language of man. We might not use that same kind of language in 2018. But as Aristotle puts it, man is a political animal. And what he means by this is that man is capable of using his speech and reason to deliberate about how men, his words, might best construct a polity or political unit that might best allow them to pursue the good life. In this picture, citizens involved in reasoned deliberation becomes an end in itself, an enactment of human beings' highest potential. This is how Aristotle puts it in Book 1 of Politics. Now, that man is more of a political animal than bees or any other gregarious animals is evident. Nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain. And man is the only animal whom she is endowed with the gift of speech. See how speech plays such an important role here? The power of speech is intended to set forth the expedient and inexpedient, and therefore, likewise, the just and the unjust. And it is characteristic of man that he alone has any sense of good and evil, of just and unjust, and the like. And the association of living beings who have this sense makes a family and a state. Now, we should certainly criticize Aristotle's fuller sense of what a political regime should naturally look like. His picture is premised on an idea that certain men of a certain economic status would be able to freely use their speech and deliberation in the public sphere. This public sphere, however, as the highest realm of human achievement, would sit atop a private sphere where women and slaves would do the hands-on labor necessary to maintain the household economy on a daily basis and thus support that public sphere. For most of us in 2018, this sexism and Aristotle's defenses of slavery are quite rightly repugnant. Nonetheless, despite this bad Aristotle, his connection of citizenship to free and reasoned discussion remains an important touchstone for thinking through how we might best understand the relationship between our individual health and the health of the greater society. And we continue to find echoes of his work in the civic republican and communitarian traditions that flourish today, in works such as Benjamin Barber's Strong Democracy and Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, both of which, in different ways, advocate for stronger citizen involvement in realizing America's best democratic potential. We might say that in this tradition inaugurated by Aristotle, this classical tradition of citizenship, that it provides a thick model of what citizenship and politics should look like. By calling this version of citizenship thick, I'm trying to underline that such a notion of citizenship entails much more than merely voting, but instead entails a more active, engaged, and consistent set of interactions with other citizens in determining the kind of world in which we live. We might also say that this tradition of citizenship is premised on the notion of positive liberty, of an affirmative enactment of freedom in the public sphere, a freedom to, as opposed to a negative freedom from, which we will see as a chief characteristic of the liberal tradition of citizenship. So let's talk about that liberal tradition of citizenship. Let me begin by saying that when we use the word liberal here, we are not using it the way we use it when we use it to talk about everyday politics in the United States in 2018. When we use it in that everyday speech, we typically use it to refer to an approach that believes that it is often necessary for the government to intervene into market activity through regulation and taxes to correct what this kind of liberal sees as the pathological effects of unfettered market activity. And we associate this everyday use of the word liberal with progressive positions on a raft of social issues ranging from abortion, same-sex marriage, race relations, and the environment. By contrast, when we talk about the liberal tradition of citizenship, we are referring to what is often called the classical tradition of liberalism, which holds that government should begin and end with the individual, and that government derives its legitimate authority from the consent of the governed. In fact, the Lockean version of classical liberalism, which I'm about to discuss in further detail, holds that government should be limited and not unnecessarily interfere in the market, which is almost the opposite of how we think of liberal when we are using the term to talk about everyday U.S. politics. So let's talk about John Locke as an exemplary figure in the articulation of this liberal tradition of citizenship. He lived from 1632 to 1704. In his most influential work on politics, two treatises of government, particularly the second treatise, centrally inform both our Declaration of Independence and, as we will see, the Bill of Rights. Given his central influence on our founding fathers, looking at some of the major tenets of his thinking is a helpful way of building our understanding of the liberal tradition of citizenship and for thinking about its continuing relevance for our contemporary political sensibilities. One of Locke's central assertions is that a legitimate government is necessarily a limited government, reflecting in large part that liberal focus on the primacy of the individual. His main idea here is that a limited government is by definition less able to intervene in the lives of its citizens, where a less limited government, that is, a government that's not limited, has a greater ability to reach into our lives in unwarranted ways. And that makes some common sense, doesn't it? If it's a smaller government, it's going to have a harder time telling us what we can and can't do. If it's a bigger government, it's going to have more of an ability to do that. Or, to put it another way, a limited government is crucial to maximizing the individual's negative liberty. But what do I mean by negative liberty? Negative liberty is sometimes described as freedom from unwarranted government intervention into our lives. We might also formulate negative liberty as our ability to order our lives on our own terms, free from unwarranted governmental intervention. We can see the influence of this notion of negative liberty in terms of how the government cannot constrain us if we look back to the Bill of Rights. And so we've got a couple of these the first 8 amendments up here in front of us. And I'm just going to try to mark out a pattern that's true for all of these first 8 amendments. So the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law. The Second Amendment says that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. The third begins, no soldier shall, and so on through the first 8 amendments. The Bill of Rights, in other words, is a list of shall nots premised on the idea of negative liberty, articulating what the government cannot do to its citizens. So when you say negative liberty, it doesn't mean bad liberty. It's negative in the sense of being about what the government cannot do to individuals. As freedom from government restraint, this is a thin notion of citizenship, right, as opposed to that thick notion of citizenship that we saw when we were talking about the classical tradition, that is premised on maximizing the capacities of citizens to pursue their private interest. When I say that the liberal tradition of citizenship is a thin notion of citizenship, I am trying to contrast it with my description of the classical tradition as a thick version of citizenship, as entailing that thick version a more active, engaged, and consistent set of interactions with other citizens in determining the kind of world in which we live. That classical thick notion of citizenship, as I remarked earlier, entails a responsibility to act, to do one's duty as a citizen. By contrast, the thin notion of citizenship articulated by Locke places much less emphasis on the responsibility of citizens. The liberal citizen is more about a certain kind of status as a rights-bearing entity, about the individual as being free to act as one wants, free from unwarranted governmental intervention. For free market Republicans, this might mean being free to pursue a natural inclination to build one's wealth. And for New Deal Democrats, this might mean being entitled to certain benefits commensurate with one's basic dignity as a human being. The point is that in both of these cases, the liberal notion of citizenship or of citizen does not require a citizen to engage in public-oriented action in order to fulfill the requirements of what citizenship entails. So, to summarize, the classical tradition of citizenship provides a model that is thick and is premised on what we might call positive liberty. The liberal tradition of citizenship, on the other hand, provides a thin model of citizenship and is premised on a notion of negative liberty. Now, I want to argue that neither of these traditions of citizenship on their own is sufficient to address what is necessary for the responsibilities of citizenship. These two models, I want to argue, need each other. So perhaps what is needed now is to bring these two traditions of citizenship, the classical and the liberal, together. Our consistently protected right of free speech flows out of the logic of liberal citizenship. That's kind of the version of liberty or freedom we've grown up with. Nonetheless, even though we are products of that liberal tradition, we continue to draw on the classical tradition at certain moments of political discourse. And I want to argue, the key to responding to our responsibilities as citizens entails augmenting the liberal tradition of citizenship with the classical tradition. So, let's try to think through how these two traditions, the classical and the liberal, can be brought together. In fact, there's a way that the two traditions cannot exist independently of one another, and we can get an inkling of this by returning to the historical record. On the one hand, the liberals, in terms of classic liberalism, who drafted the U.S. Constitution, spoke very little about freedom of speech, presumably because they recognized that free speech was necessary for the health of the body politic. In other words, they recognized that freedom of expression is about more than negative liberty. It is also a positive aspect of that body politic. The ability to speak freely is essential for enacting a freedom that articulates the case against governmental despotism, and the ability to articulate those objections is in fact a positive enactment of our freedom in and of itself. On the other hand, returning to the ancient Greeks, we can see that a freedom to speak, that is, of not being prevented from speaking freely, is a prerequisite for enacting the positive aspects that is central to their notion of citizenship and the public good. So we go back to look at some examples. We can see this in Pericles' funeral oration. As reported by Thucydides, Pericles, Athens' leading statesman during the early phases of the Peloponnesian War, sought to distinguish democratic Athens from the closed society of Sparta by noting, "Our public men have, besides politics, their private affairs to attend to. And their ordinary citizens, though occupied with the pursuits of industry, are still fair judges of public matters. For unlike any other nation, regarding him who takes no part in these duties, not as unambitious, but as useless, we Athenians are able to judge at all events. If we cannot originate them, and instead of looking on discussion as a stumbling block in the way of action, we think it an indispensable preliminary to any wise action at all." So I'm just trying to bring forth a little bit how the freedom to speak is connected to what is best for the society in terms of thinking through what's best for that society. This recognition of the importance of a freedom of speech and thinking freely is also on display in Plato's portrayal of Socrates in the Apology. Another HMXP reading, right? He argues that this work in the public square is for the public good. By challenging the status quo, he acts as a gadfly to the state. And he says in Plato's text, "For if you kill me, you will not easily find another like me, who, if I may use such a ludicrous figure of speech, am a sort of gadfly," a little stinging insect, right? "Given to the state by the god. And the state is like a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has given the state, and all day long and in all places am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. And that general approach about the importance of a critical reason is something that we see in the work of John Stuart Mill's qualified utilitarian approach to liberalism in the 1800s, which anchors the right to free expression in a commitment to a better understanding of the truth in its connection to the common good. Rather than appealing to the right of free thought and expression, Mill points to the utilitarian value of this freedom, how it is in the best interest of both individuals and the society as a whole. He assumes that more knowledge of the truth, at whatever level or in whatever context it is being contested, is in the best interest of the society. So connection, truth, the best interest of society. And the individuals in that society, and that an enlightened society of enlightened individuals is a better society. As most of you students again know from your HMXP readings, Mill in On Liberty gives 4 specific reasons for giving alternative versions of truth a fair hearing. And so there's an idea here in the story Mill tells that, hey, we have some kind of consensus of what the truth is, and then a new idea comes along and challenges that truth. And he's making an argument we should give that new truth a fair hearing. So he says, first of all, we should give that new truth, that new asserted truth, because a newly asserted truth might be true. To deny that possibility is to deny human fallibility. Second, both the accepted truth and the newly asserted truth can contain aspects of truth. Both of them might be right in some kind of way. The truth, to use his language, is often superadded. Third, even if the new assertion of what is true turns out to be completely false, the new view forces us to clarify our own understanding. It spurs us to articulate why we affirm the received truth, and thus, I would say, helps us know why we think that truth is the truth. And then finally, even if the new assertion of what is true turns out to be completely false, a challenge to receive truth prevents it from falling into dead dogma. This final reason suggests that we should actively engage questions by living and contesting the truths that we endorse, actively defending our positions with reason. For Mill, then, a pursuit of truth entails the ongoing contestation of the truth. Such an orientation suggests that the best society is one actively creating itself in relationship to its best understanding of the truth. So to say it another way, with Mill, we see how freedom of speech, or freedom of thought and expression, is fundamental to the pursuit of truth. And we can see in turn how that pursuit is central to creating the best kind of society that we can have. So you see, I'm really trying to draw a connection between freedom of speech and the pursuit of truth as being an important thing to keep in mind. In fact, I want to argue that this anchoring of the right to I think what I was trying to say is, I want to argue that this anchoring of the right to free expression in relationship to a responsibility to seek the truth in the name of the common good, a tradition that we have seen stretches from the ancient Greeks to Mill and into the 20th century, strikes me as particularly timely in the context of our current crises of truth. Now, what do I mean by the current crises of truth? Well, let's use a little popular culture here. Back in 2005, Stephen Colbert coined the term truthiness, right, to capture this problem, which can be defined as the quality of seeming or being felt to be true, even if not necessarily true. As he elaborated on his show, The Colbert Report, we're not talking about truth, we're talking about something that seems like truth, the truth we want to exist. He introduced this definition of truthiness by saying, now I'm sure that some of the word police, the wordinistas over at Webster's are going to say, hey, that's not a word. Well, anybody who knows me knows I'm no fan of dictionaries or reference books. They're elitist, constantly telling us what is or isn't true, or what did or didn't happen. At the time, Colbert coined the term to parody the George W. Bush administration and their handling of the invasion of Iraq. But the general idea that his term captures seems to still be with us. So, for example, Kellyanne Conway defended the erroneous claims made by the Trump White House about the crowd size at Trump's inauguration as not being erroneous, but rather alternative facts. More recently, we have heard Rudy Giuliani, the president's attorney, defend the president's reluctance to be interviewed by the Mueller investigation by arguing that the truth isn't truth. And recently, the Washington Post reported that Trump himself has now made over 5,000 false statements since assuming the presidency. Now, Trump, I'm trying to be fair and balanced here, Trump has responded to these kinds of accusations, and in fact, most negative reporting about his presidency as being fake news. So, for example, he has tweeted that, and he's tweeted things about fake news many, many, many times, but here's one of them. They asked my daughter Ivanka whether or not the media is the enemy of the people. She correctly said no. It is the fake news, which is a large percentage of the media. That is the enemy of the people. And to point to one final phenomenon, it is now well known that Russian bots spread and continue to spread false information about a variety of subjects across a variety of social media platforms. Now, we could get into a heated discussion about who is more truthful, the mainstream media or Trump and his representatives, or whether Russian bots had a discernible effect on the outcome of the 2016 presidential election, but that's not really my point in the context of this discussion. Rather, I'm trying to underline where we are, or that we are at a point in our history where what counts as the truth, as a bedrock set of facts about the way the world actually is, seems to be in crisis. In particular, we seem to have lost a sense of what can count as a common basis for public discourse, and thus as a basis for how we might work with one another across our disagreements to figure out how to find common ground or even the basis for reasoned disagreement. We disagree so much we can't even find a basis for disagreeing, right? Now, part of the problem here is that part of the problem that we face is that the truth is often contestable. There is something to Giuliani's claim that the truth isn't truth. It isn't that, though, that the truth is not the truth, I would say, but rather that what counts as our best effort to know what the truth is cannot be separated from doubt. Returning to Plato's rendering of Socrates in the Apology, or Plato tells us that Socrates insists that if he is wise, that is, if he, Socrates, is wise, it is because he knows that his knowledge and understanding are limited. His is a human wisdom, not a divine knowledge. But we might go further and recognize that the most certain of knowledges, science itself, is organized in terms of an inherent contestability. Again, as you know from your HMXP classes, the 20th century philosopher of science, Karl Popper, would put it that knowledge can only be scientific knowledge if it is potentially falsifiable. That is, that it is based on testable hypotheses that might disprove those hypotheses. But the contestability of truth is even more stark when we are talking about the keywords that we use when we are talking about politics. What do we mean, for example, when we talk about freedom, or power, or justice, or equality? I would hold that differently situated actors and different political partisans will often define these terms in different ways. My remarks, in fact, have highlighted that there are two different notions of citizenship and two corresponding different notions of freedom. So even in this discussion, I'm highlighting the ways in which a true definition of something can be essentially contestable. Furthermore, our very technological achievements, particularly in the fields of electronic informational media, have provided us unparalleled power to find information and to communicate with one another. And though this technological democratization of knowledge has many important benefits, providing more people more access to each other and to important knowledge about the world, it has also had negative effects, sometimes fragmenting the basis for a shared sense of what the truth is, and more importantly, how we might find a common basis for working through our disagreements about the truth, or how, to repeat, we might even find the language about how we might reasonably agree to disagree. Again, the point here isn't that there isn't truth. Rather, I'm suggesting that relating to the truth, understanding its value, being able to pursue it against the backdrop of our human fallibility, requires a kind of sophistication, a set of abilities that need to be nurtured if we are going to be the kind of free society capable of meeting the challenges that face us. Whether those problems be economic, environmental, religious, political, moral, or, as is most typically the case, a combination of these interrelated domains. That kind of sophistication, though, is not easy for a people to attain. It depends upon a commitment to a broad-based education. I would argue that it entails what we have commonly called a liberal education. Now, again, I want to stress that the word liberal here does not refer to an education that would transform students into political liberals. In fact, my first exposure to this notion of liberal education came at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia. And I can assure you that that all-male institution was not a bastion of progressive liberalism. Rather, by liberal education, I mean the kind of broad-based education that exposed students to a wide range of knowledge from various disciplines, and which provides students the tools to be better thinkers. An education, in other words, that gives students the tools to liberate their minds, that helps students build the kind of freedom that comes with being in charge of their own lives. Such an education teaches them to read well, to write well, to think analytically, to understand phenomena from a variety of perspectives as a way of testing our preconceived notions about that phenomena, that exposes us to the cultural heritage of a wide variety of places, peoples, and times, and which trains our students how to interact with others through the reasoned exchange of ideas. At a university like Winthrop, we, in short, don't only prepare you to enter into particular careers, even though that is an important part of what we do. We teach you to become critical thinkers who have the kind of flexible intelligence that allows you to adapt to new situations and solve unexpected problems. Not only is this critical flexibility what employers are increasingly telling colleges that they are looking for in its employees, it is also a kind of insurance policy that will help students respond to those kinds of economic and technological changes that can have profound effects on the job markets, sometimes eliminating entire sectors of work. When that happens, you better have the kind of mind that will allow you to adapt. And I want to argue that a liberal education is one of the best bets for providing us or helping to cultivate that kind of adaptability. And for all of you students in the audience, you're lucky to attend Winthrop University, an institution that takes this approach to education very seriously. So I guess in some ways I'm challenging you students out there a little bit. I urge you to take advantage of your educational opportunity and to treat it very seriously as part of your steps towards fulfilling your responsibilities as citizens and of living freely in the fullest sense of the word. This means, I think, taking your classes seriously and placing them at the center of how you approach your college experience. But it also requires, I think, a kind of maturity on your part, which means embracing those classes outside of your interest or major that you might find challenging. It entails avoiding that it entails avoiding that sophomoric excuse that a class is not something that you will ever use. Quite frankly, you cannot know how your future will unfold or how something you learn now might inform something that you face later. More importantly, I want to challenge you to take those classes seriously because they teach you how to think through that which is unfamiliar, and they help you build the flexibility of your intelligence. And not only is that kind of intelligence crucial economically, as I've tried to suggest. It is also something that prepares you to become the kinds of thinkers who are the best prepared to live well across all the facets of your life, and perhaps most importantly in the context of this discussion, to be able to live up to your responsibilities as citizens. In short, the liberal education that Winthrop offers you prepares you for freedom, helping you become the kinds of citizens for whom free speech can have a relevant meaning. For all of us, though, not just the students, but all of us in the audience, including myself, I think we need to think seriously about the challenges that face higher education and which run the risk of eviscerating the role that it plays in a free society. What does eviscerating mean? Cut the stomach out of something, right? So we need to think about how higher education is beset with some pretty profound challenges. As I hope my remarks have made clear, we must recognize the way in which the facts of life are economic. And we take our role in building students' ability to flourish economically very seriously. But I also think that it is important to critically recognize how the economic imperatives that shape our lives also threaten the ability of higher education to provide students the broader training necessary for a free society. As the politics of deregulation have gained momentum over the last 40 years, the logic of our market economy has increasingly colonized all aspects of our lives. The university is no exception to this rule. Increasingly, the value of an education is being solely understood in terms of the economic outputs that it produces. And there is increasing pressure to move away from courses, let us say philosophy and literature courses, that do not, at least in the popular imagination, lead directly to jobs. I'm not saying that they don't lead to jobs. I'm saying that's what people think. Now, I hope my remarks make it clear that this kind of dismissal of those kinds of courses is a kind of abdication of our broader social responsibility to provide an education that cultivates the capacity for free thought and expression. When we stop, I'm paraphrasing W.B. Du Bois here for those who recognize the allusion, when we stop in our progress towards this kind of freedom to pick up the golden apples, we run the risk of losing the race. So, to summarize the twist of my comments on free speech and the responsibilities of citizenship, I find it essential to argue that free speech only has meaning, particularly in the mediatized culture in which we live, to the degree that we have the tools to exercise that speech in relationship to our quest for the truth. And that quest entails, in no small part, a dedication to the kind of education which still, at least for the time being, is available at public universities like Winthrop. I will close then simply with the inscription that one finds across the roofline of the Boston Public Library. The Commonwealth, this is what it reads. You can't see it very well, but I was there recently and I saw it. It reads, "The Commonwealth requires the education of the people as the safeguard of order and liberty." So let's keep that in mind as we do our work, as students and as teachers, and very importantly as citizens. Quite literally, our freedom depends upon it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lipscomb. I'd like to pause for a moment and invite people to take out their mobile devices and take a 1-minute 6-question survey about the event. I also would like to say we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. So I will be happy to come to you as I know you're working on your survey. But if someone has a question they'd like to ask, let me know. Questions or comments?
So talking about Giuliani and saying truth is not truth, I think if you look at his full remarks, he's saying one version of truth is different from somebody else's version of truth. And if you look at a journalist who talks to various people at a crime scene or a detective, he'll get different versions of the truth. And so truth depends on context, is what he was trying to say. I'm trying to be fair to what he was saying.
Yeah, and I hope it was clear that I was trying to be fair to him as well. I did go on to say that there's a way in which he's right. Right. Now, of course, how does something that gets said just get disseminated throughout the throughout the public sphere, right? And that statement that he made got detached from the context in which he said it, and it becomes almost like a meme. In fact, it has become a meme that gets shared, and I think, and this is my point, starts to reinforce this idea that a lot of people have that we have no basis for what counts as the truth, that in fact the truth is relative and that we can't know what it is. Now, I'm arguing that we have to get more sophisticated. We have to both recognize that truth is contestable, but also know ways and think through ways in which reason can allow us to talk about that contestability, that will allow us to find areas of agreement, ways we can build consensus, the way that we can coordinate action amongst one another. And when that fails, figure out ways that we can agree to disagree. So yeah, I agree completely. We should be fair to what Giuliani said. Yeah.
Other questions and comments?
Thank you. Lovely presentation. I'm glad I came for this. Something that I've thought personally, but also generally, is that it is this very institution that endorses open-mindedness, as we've basically been talking about here, the idea that truth is contestable. But here's a thought. What if that innovation, that cultural innovation or social innovation, is one of the key ingredients to the reliance on overt utility or pragmatism, such as statistics on economic benefit of a college career? Personally, philosophy, religious studies graduate, no job in that field. I had opportunities, but I feel they were somewhat limited. Not to totally disagree with what you were saying at the end there about philosophy and literature, for example, but I guess what I'm saying is open-mindedness, I think, unchecked, is potentially one of the reasons that we are having a hard time contesting freedom. It's a very weird, paradoxical thing, but let me try to phrase this into a question. Is it possible that the very function you hope for higher education to have, is one of the ingredients in a reliance on pragmatism or sort of superficial utilitarianism?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Yeah, you know, my conservative stepfather used to say that your mind, he was of course criticizing me, was saying your mind is so much like a sponge that it absorbs everything, and because it absorbs everything, you can't make judgments or distinctions that you need to make to live successfully. And I think that might be part of what I'm at. But what I would say is this, that you have to be honest about the limits of how beings like us, human beings like us, can know the truth in order to be in a position to think about how we can make judgments, how we can assert that this is where we're going as opposed to this being where we're going. Now that makes our work a lot harder, right, as educated folks, right? But I think it's a necessary process to go through. And now I'll go back to your discussion, your mentioning of pragmatism. I actually think that this kind of openness is, despite how it might not seem to be the case, very pragmatic. Because there's a way in which hearing the different perspectives that people have, the different way that people world from where they are situated can inform a more robust overall picture of a particular problem that we're dealing with. Now, I think you're right. At the end of the day, we have to make that judgment that'll be the basis of moving forward in a successful or an admirable kind of way. But I want to pick up one other thing that I think that you were getting at in your comments, and that is, doesn't cultivating the open-mindedness that's one of the bases of higher education, traditionally been one of the bases of higher education, doesn't that make us vulnerable to those out there in the world who don't want to be open-minded, who simply want to push very direct kind of way that we are less able to respond to because we always want to step back and consider the bigger picture, right? Well, you know, again, I think that building the capacity for open-mindedness should not necessarily where we have to be defenseless in that kind of way. I think, in fact, that it can inform over the course of time a way of getting at specific positions that we hold and that we can have confidence in because we considered them in this open-minded kind of way. I go back to that quote from Pericles, right, where he was trying to say why Athens was better than Sparta. We do cherish and encourage freedom of speech because we think it's a prelude to acting in the best way, not a detriment to acting in the best way. So that's one way that you might respond to those very legitimate concerns that you're expressing.
All right, it's a great presentation. And as far as the First Amendment goes, we obviously just talked about this in your class. How do we balance curtailing that with being responsible citizens and responsible journalists? Because like he was saying, the social media platforms, for example, they have blacklisted Alex Jones, the Sandy Hook conspiracy theorist, who had this huge platform and had people since 2012 harassing and attacking the parents of the victims of, you know, those poor little kids because he was saying it wasn't true. And that's been going on for years, and they finally, under pressure, shut him down. So how do you strike that balance between free speech and being responsible enough to be like, hey, somebody like this should not have a platform? And what should the role of social media platform CEOs be?
Well, if we're talking about it in First Amendment terms, whether or not the owners of these platforms are bound by the First Amendment remains an ongoing and emerging area of law that is probably not perfectly settled yet, right? But just to talk about it in general terms, I will go back to one of the first tests that were ever developed related to the constitutionality of laws that sought to prohibit free speech. And I'm thinking of Oliver Wendell Holmes' decision in Schenck v. United States in 1919, right, where he developed what is called the clear and present danger test, right? And his idea was that the government can pass laws that curtail free speech if it can be shown that that speech will lead to someone being harmed, in the context of that, to the country being harmed and to threats to order and security, right? But in this case, it strikes me that what Alex Jones was doing, claiming that of the victims of the Sandy Hook massacre were that it was a hoax, that these folks were actors of some sort, and then taking the extra step, I think, of revealing their addresses. Is that right? Is that what he did? That seems to me to cross a line in terms of putting people in danger. As you know, Holmes in that decision said, freedom of speech does not give us the right to yell fire in a crowded theater or a crowded room like this when there is no fire, right? That would put us all in danger as we scrambled trying to get out of the building, right? So I think that even though it's not clear that the situation that you're referring to can be covered perfectly by the First Amendment, that general principle seems to make some sense in how we might think through what the responsibilities of CEOs are, right? If people are acting, speaking in ways on those platforms that create a clear and present danger to people, then I think that there's good rationale for those folks to step in and prevent that from happening.
We have one final question, and I want to say, before we get to that question, first of all, I want to thank everybody for doing the survey. And I also want to remind everybody that there's an amazing website that a Winthrop student created for the News Literacy series. It's newsliteracy.info. So please check it out so you can keep up with the 10 remaining events for the year for the series. So here's our final question.
My question is, if truth is not truth and it can be contested like you said, so then what is truth? And even at that, is there no more truth in political reporting? And even our account of what really happened, you made reference to if an event happened, police could come around and get two different sides to the story. So then, who do the media audience listen to about what truth is? Who do they believe? Is it the media reporters or the political actors? And in this case, our president in quote is saying the media, 90% of the media is fake news. So now there's a dilemma.
That sure is a dilemma. How do we discern the truth?
Thank you for that simple question. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that I turn towards the importance of higher education, because I think that it helps us build the ability, gives us some of the tools that allow us to make good judgments about what constitutes the truth in a specific context. The ability to weigh the different kinds of positions that people hold related to a particular issue. An ability to look at the historical record to make judgments about what people assert in relationship to a particular context. How to reason, to engage in syllogistic reason in ways that helps us build the internal consistency of our thinking. How it helps us build an ability to talk to one another when we have different perspectives about what the truth is. And how it teaches us that we have an obligation when we're engaged in those conversations to provide reasons and evidence to support our case and not just fall back into truthiness. You know, that idea that we want it to be true rather than being able to demonstrate it's true in terms of the criteria of good evidence and what counts as good sources, and all of those different skills that you build across the curriculum at Winthrop and in your core classes like HMXP and CRTW, right? And lots of other courses as well, right? Like our philosophy and literature courses, right? Okay, and our mass comm courses.
And political science.
Yeah, and political.
I just want to add one thing to that great question. You know, our country might be about to see a public hearing of Judge Kavanaugh, who has one truth about what happened at a particular event, and a woman who's accusing him of sexual assault who will have a different truth about what happened at a particular event. And so I heard Jeffrey Toobin, legal analyst for CNN, say yesterday, you know what, everyone wants to reduce things to a he said, she said, where we really can't know the truth. But if we were developing a case, you know, what would attorneys do? What would the police do? What would detectives do? They would try to gather corroborating evidence. They would try to find out, well, whose house was the party at? Who were the supposed attendees? Who were the people who attended the party? Let's talk to them. In other words, in trying to discern the truth, it often takes a lot of work to talk to a lot of people and try to find out how many people's perspectives follow this sense of the truth and how many people's perspectives, eyewitnesses, follow this view of the truth. And sometimes that's the best we can do, is try to approximate or get at the truth. But sometimes we're too quick, I think, to reduce it to he said, she said, in that particular case of sexual assault, when you can actually seek out and find corroborating evidence. And that's what we want you all to do here at Winthrop University. Let's give Dr. Lipscomb a round of applause. We want to thank you all for being here and for your great attention, and we'll see you at October 2nd, the next event in the series. Thank you very much.